In today's video, I'm going to be forging a pair of wolf jaw tongs. Hi, I'm Dennis Frechette and welcome back. Today I'm going to be reposting a video that I did a few years ago on making a pair of wolf jaw tongs. If you're not familiar with wolf jaw tongs, they look a lot like bowl tongs, but they have some extra notches cut into the sides of the jaws, and that allows you to hold bar stocks across the jaws as well as along the length of the jaws. So they're handy for a lot of different work. This was a video that was originally a three-part series, and I've condensed it down, did a little bit of editing, so it's a little bit easier to watch. So hope you enjoy it. Today I'm going to be forging this pair of tongs out of a piece of 3/8 by 3/4 flat bar. Here I'm laying out the first offset, which is the length of the jaws. I'm going to be forging this offset down to about half the width of the bar, and then I'm just going to be forging a basic taper back to the original width of the bar. I want to make this taper as short as possible because I know that the next offset needs to be in the full width of the bar. Now, even though this taper isn't going to be the taper that I'm using for the jaws, I still have to record the length of this taper because I need to make the other half of the pairs of tongs exactly the same. If I have two different tapers, I'm going to be working with two different volumes of metal when I go to forge the final shape of the jaws. And that will affect the length of each section. Now I need to measure for the offset that's going to define the transition to the hinge area of the tongs. And I'm going to be measuring that from the inside edge of the transition that defines the jaws. And from that point, I'm going to be refining this taper so that it's a little bit thicker than half the material at the hinge area, and then tapering down to the half thickness that I have at the jaws. And the last measurement that I need to take at the anvil is the actual length of the forged bar at this point. And I'm going to be measuring that from the offset for the hinge area to the offset for the jaws. In addition to that length, I'm also going to be documenting the actual dimensions of the bar at the transition for the jaws and the transition to the hinge area. So with those three pieces of information, I'm going to be able to reproduce these jaws exactly. I'm not as concerned about the actual length of the jaws because they can be trimmed back very easily. But the length of that strap between the offset for the hinge area and the offset for the jaws, that has to be exactly right. Otherwise, you're not going to wind up with a symmetrical pair of tongs. At this point, I'm ready to start forging the jaws. And the first step is to cut a groove that is parallel to the length of the jaws and halfway down the width of the jaws. This groove is going to be the standard V-shaped jaws that you have on all bolt tongs, and later on I'll be cutting grooves across the width of these jaws to make the actual wolf jaw section of the tongs. The lower half is going to be left untouched because that's the backbone that's going to support all of these little pieces and give you a strong set of jaws to work with. To actually shape the jaws, I'm going to be using a fuller that has a pretty wide radius, and I'm going to be using that to push the narrow edges of the jaws over into that V shape. And you'll notice that the vice jaws are positioned right at the bottom of the groove at the halfway mark for the width of the jaws. So here I'm a little further along and the jaws have been roughed out, so I can continue forging these tong blanks the way I would any other pair of bolt tongs. Here I'm creating the offset that's going to form the transition from the hinge area to the handles, and I'm measuring that at about 1 inch. And the final step for rough forging the working end of this pair of tongs is to bring that transition down to the starting dimensions for the reins, which is again a little bit over half the width of the bar section at that point. Regardless of the type of tongs that you're making, the heaviest sections of the bar are always at the hinge area, whether it's going to the jaws or to the reins. You start off with a heavy section there and it tapers down to the final working dimensions. That gives you the strongest possible pair of tongs that you can make. Here I've started working on the second half of the pair of tongs, and of course I'm following the same procedure, but the point I'm trying to make here is that with every chance that I have, I compare what I'm working with the original to make sure that I'm on the right track. Now, when I made these tongs originally, I'm sure that I did the math and calculated how much length I was going to need to for the reins and cut the bars to that length. Unfortunately, I failed to put that information in the original video. Since then, I've been making tongs with 5/8 square bars, and I've been using that pretty much exclusively as a standard for the tongs that I'm making from now on. And I'm going to include that information at the end of this video because as it happens, the bar that I'm using for these tongs is almost exactly the same volume as the 5/8 square bar that I'm using now. So that'll give you a pretty good idea of where to get started. And if you haven't seen the series on making tongs using 5/8 bars, I'll include the links to those videos in the description. And the process that I'm describing in those videos is exactly what I'm doing here because it's exactly what I've been doing for years and years. The only difference is that I refined it a little bit and I cut the length of the tong reins into two bar sections. So you start off by forging the two rough bar sections and then you start connecting those two sections into a long taper. Here is the original process where I start at the hinge area with the bar stock that I'm going to leave untouched, and then I forge the smallest end of the bar down to the size that I'm looking for, and here I'm just forging out everything in between and connecting those 2 points. So the system that I'm providing in the charts at the end of the video, and if you watch those videos, you'll see that I've just broken it down into a couple of different sections, and that makes it a lot easier if you're not used to forging long tapers. At this point, I have both of the reins forged out, and I'm getting ready to assemble the tongs. So I'm cutting the square slot that I'm going to use to drift the round hole that's going to accept the rivet. I always use this two-step process for forging the pivot point of the hinge because it really reduces the amount of material that you need to have for the hinge area. Now that all the forging is done and I know I'm going to get a pair of tongs out of this, I'm going to take the time to cut the V-notches across the width of the jaws that are going to turn these bull tongs into wolf jaw tongs. And to do that, I'm going to remove most of the material with a hacksaw, and then I'm going to refine the shape with an angle grinder. Wolfjaw tongs usually have 3 notches cut into the jaws. The largest one is usually at the back, and it tapers down to the smallest one right at the very tip of the tongs. The illustration that I'm showing you here is not an optical illusion. They all start off being the same size. What I'm trying to do here is just make sure that I have the 90-degree profile that I need for each tooth. The drawing also shows an idealized version of these teeth. What I'm going to be doing is using the angle grinder to create a combination of a V-notch that has a well-rounded section at the bottom. Because that's normally what you find on wolf jaw tongs. These notches are usually made with a fuller, and the idea is that one of them is likely going to be able to grab onto whatever it is you're trying to hold. The final shape of the teeth is achieved by grinding a slope to the main V-notch of the tongs. That not only reduces the size of each teeth, it also reduces the amount of material on each side of the V-notch, which is what you need when you're trying to hold on to different size material. And the final step in the process is to assemble the two halves the same way you would any other pair of tongs. Here I'm using a straight bar rivet, and the length of the bar stock that I'm using is determined by a simple formula. You need to add 3 times the diameter of the rivet to the total thickness of the material that you're riveting. And that's if you need to form 2 heads, as I have here. If you're using a rivet that already has 1 head formed, you're only adding 1.5 times the diameter of the rivet. You always start the rivet very slowly with a very, very light hammer. You work a little bit on each side until the rivet heads begin to form. At that point, you could move to a heavier hammer to finish setting the rivet and shaping the overall dimensions. At this point, when the rivet is still clamping the two jaws together, it's a good time to refine the overall shape of the jaws if you need to do any adjustments. And once you're happy with how everything is lining up, you can reheat the hinge area, place one of the legs in the jaws of a vise, and slowly work the hinge area free. This may take more than one heat, but just keep working at it until everything works smoothly. If you feel that there's too much slop in the hinge area, you can retighten the rivet and then repeat the whole process as many times as you need to get the fit that you want. The last step of the process is to size the jaws for the bar stock that you intend to be using. This will also tilt the jaws towards each other so that the two faces are parallel.